So I wanted to talk about proportional representation in British Columbia and proportional representation generally. Just as a note, the referendum is going to go until the end of November, so it is. We do have a full month of voting that's going to be occurring, and you will notice as soon as the municipal elections wrap up, we'll see shortly after that there will be ballots coming in the mail. So if anyone hasn't had a chance to register themselves with Elections BC, if you haven't voted previously or at the same address, definitely go online and you can update your voting information to make sure that they have your address and your name so that they can send you a voting package. And that's really important with this election. It's going to be a mail-in ballot, so I wanted to make sure before we begin that's something that everyone considers. Now, I do have another question of the audience. Does anybody use a smartphone? Yeah. Another quick question. Does anyone actually use one of these devices? There we go. What is this? Has anyone never used one of these devices before? Well, this is what we used to have in every house. It's a simple device. It's a stable device. You know, and why would we ever change from such a simple and stable device? Well, the reality is just because we're familiar with something doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. And that's what a lot of this debate is going to be. Are we going to stay with the current system because we're familiar with it? Or are we going to be looking at another system that has more features, more functions, and does more? And that really is what this debate is going to be, or at least what it should be. Now, does it mean that everything that you adapt is better? No, that's a question to debate. But it doesn't necessarily mean just because something's new and we haven't used it before, we should give up, not adopt a smartphone, maintain one of these. I haven't personally ever used a phone that I had to dial rotary on as well, so I picked the oldest phone I could find as an example. And I think I have an outlet in my house, but I haven't had one installed in many, many years myself. So as far as proportional representation in British Columbia goes, I just want to kind of start, bring you back to the roots of British Columbia. So this is a map of what BC's voting systems look like in, I don't think it was our first election, I think it was our second election. I believe I took the 1971 map. Large districts, most of the province, it was pretty scarce province at that time. But there was the ridings weren't like what we know today. It wasn't the single ridings that we deal with. There were multi-member ridings. So we would have, Abbotsford would be part of the Yale riding, which would be pretty much the entire Fraser Valley up the canyon. Yeah, we had three members, 1971, 3 members. Charles Semlin actually ended up becoming a premier at one point. But, you know, so when we talk about the history of voting in BC, we're not stable as a province. And in this election, the other interesting thing in the first election, 1871, I believe would have been, you know, you can see, this is how the first election happened in our area. The winners won with a total of about 53 votes. That was the highest vote count. There was, you would have been able to vote for 3 people, so there was just under about 60 people voting in that election for the whole district. So it's, if we think about today, the average voting district in BC very well might be closer to 40,000 voters. So 1971 was, in that election we had multi-member ridings, but and there was a lot of things that changed. The first election was actually hands up. So we would all get into a room together, we decide who we wanted to vote for, we put our hands up. You know, if we didn't see the majority in the room voting for one person or another, we might, switch our votes to another candidate. So we had and by we, none of us was obviously around at that time, but that's how the first election happened. Other things that were, kind of have changed since that point is, renters have, if you were a renter, you wouldn't have been able to vote in that first election. In fact, you wouldn't have been able to vote until 1878. Women, and I see a few ladies in the room, we had the first women could vote in BC in 1917. Political parties didn't even show up in the ballot until the 20s and then 40s for most of the province. And if you were Mennonite, Indian, Japanese, 1948 was the first time you cast a vote, and we lowered the voting age in 1992 to 18. So there's been a lot of changes. Our electoral system is by no means stationary. We've adopted over time, we've embraced. We've looked at ways to bring more people into the voting system as we realize that excluding people is probably not the best way to go. We also changed the size of ridings, and we've used different so throughout a lot of the early years, there was multi-member ridings. At one point, there was ridings up to 6 members representing that riding. So BC has had, what we know today, this one person, one riding thing, is a relatively new concept for BC, for a lot of the province. We've even used a different voting system in 1952. We did use a ranked ballot, which is kind of familiar. There's one of the voting systems of the proportional representation, relies on a very similar ballot, and that you would actually rank the candidates, and depending on if no one was able to get the majority of the votes, we would look at different preferences. And I will talk about the voting systems that we're using on this modern thing. So I just wanted to kind of point out things haven't changed. Now, I'm going to fast forward. I don't want to give the history lesson of voting in BC, because I won't cover that in an hour. But I wanted to kind of talk about the modern era of electoral reform. So there was 2 kind of notable elections, and these were a few years ago. But starting in 1996, we had an election where it was the last election that the NDP won prior to this most recent election. And I'll step out of the way if anyone can't see it a little bit. But in that election, the Liberals actually had more votes, yet the NDP ended up with 52% of the seats. So it's not, if you think about how an election works under our current system, there's not really always a relationship to how many votes a party gets and to how many seats. Usually we see a party with the most votes will get the most seats. And often we see elections like in 2001 where we saw the Liberals get 58% of the vote, and they ended up with a total of 97% of the seats. So there's very little correlation between the number of votes you get and the number of seats you get. The way that our current system works is every riding, the person with the most votes, no matter how much of a percentage they get, is the person who represents us. So a lot of people says this is the system that we're used to using. We know who gets elected, and it's the person with the most votes. But when you look at the province as a whole and you get outside of your vote, there's definitely a difference between how people vote and the government and the representation we get. So following those 2 elections, BC endeavored in its first experiment with electoral reform, and we had something called the Citizens' Assembly. They wanted to try to move it outside of a politicized voting system. They didn't want to get people in parties pushing their will upon the people. So it was actually a very interesting idea. They sent out random notices to voters. There was a lady and a man from each of the ridings in British Columbia. They had basically groups like this get together, a larger group of about 150 people, discuss in depth, learn about electoral systems, look at areas, countries, define the values in British Columbia, and try to come up with an idea that really a voting system they thought was going to work best for BC's unique. Because one of the things we know is not countries are very different. You can have a very small country with lots of people, or you can have a very sparse country with lots of people, or you can get a place like British Columbia that has a lot of people in a very small area and a very few people in a much larger area. And how do you accommodate that? So in that Citizens' Assembly, they had identified 3 values that they thought were important for individuals, and many of us would say this really comes true today, that these values very well might be what you would want to vote. You might have different values you can incorporate. The one thing about electoral reform and voting systems is there's no perfect system. Each of us might have different values. So we're trying to find a system that works for everybody, and the system we choose may not be the most popular amongst everyone, but we have to kind of ultimately choose one. Proportional representation was one of the guiding principles. They wanted those differences between votes and seats to match up a little bit. Effective local representation, and by that, they didn't want to have a situation where you just voted for parties and you didn't have anybody representing unique geography. Whether you're in Vancouver or Prince George, you might have very different issues. So they wanted to have some semblance of the region or the area represented, and to make sure those regional issues had a home, that we didn't abandon the regional representation like we have. And they represented something called greater voter choices. They wanted voters to have a little more control over who represented them and not just how the parties would decide on who the candidates would be, take it or leave it. So those were the systems that they had done. We voted on it. They came up with a system called the single transferable vote. It's an interesting system. It's actually almost on the ballot in our current election, with a few modifications based on trying to make a difference in how BC votes as well. And it was a system that is most commonly found and known as the Irish system. Australia uses it for the Senate, and the basis of this system was you rank your candidates, and the candidate, if there was 3 or 4 people in the district, you would set a bar, and if any candidate got above that bar on their first choice, they got elected. And if they didn't get above that bar on the first choice, we kind of knocked off the lowest choice candidates and had their votes transferred to people's second choice. So if you voted for a very small party and they didn't get elected, you would have the option of having your votes help another person get above that bar. But other places, and I just want to point out that that was a system they recommended for British Columbia. Ontario had a very similar process, and they recommended a different voting system. So just because just because one group of individuals says, hey, this is a great idea for our province, it doesn't mean that another group of people going through the same exercise might come up with a different result. And that's the thing about political science and electoral reform. In many ways, it's more of an art than a science. There's not, you're not putting an input value and you're getting a true result out of it. In many ways, it's much more subjective than a very objective thing that would happen as far as voting goes. They had a vote in 2005. 57% of the people supported it. 77 ridings voted over 50%, which you would think by all measures that would be something that was adopted. The government had said, we're not going to make it binding unless 60%. So even though most of the province said, hey, this is worth a try, the government said, no, we need a little bit more. But they after that election, they said, and how about we try it again? They tried it again, and probably as a result of a few different factors, in 2009, there was a coalition government that attempt, and it would have involved the Bloc Quebec law that turned people off. But there was also, they had also come up with some voting maps for the interior of BC, and one of them ended up being this 5-person voting member riding in Caribou-Thompson that, if you can see the small map on the side, pretty much looks like it covers about 1/3 of the province. So even though most people probably only, give me a second here. Even though most people probably only lived in really 2 or 3 of these tiny voting districts, when you look at a map, it's a huge riding. No one lives here, no one lives here, no one lives here. But it did raise some questions about whether that system at the time, with that specific proposed map, would be the best system to use. Now, moving forward, we've had 2 more recent elections, and again, very similar results. No real correlation between how many votes you get and how many seats you get. In our last election, it was pretty much, you could see the 2 parties on paper were divided quite evenly, with a 17% winning going to the Green Party here, but when it came down to voting, it was almost down the middle. In fact, it was so controversial, it took us about a month to actually figure out which party would be able to secure a government. So you can see this has kind of raised a few more questions, and this is the story of our election system. There's no correlation. We get a winner, usually. Sometimes we get a minority. And even though these 2 parties ended up with the big chunk of the pie of votes, people say, well, you only had 1 extra seat. So what is the legitimacy? How many people you represent, or how many seats you get? And our current system really is based on how many seats you get. Some people like that, and that's the question for everyone to explore. Do you want to keep a system that works like that, or do you want to have a system that works differently? So, part of the election campaign, 2 of the major parties that form government had both said, hey, we do want to bring this back to the voters or back to the province, this idea of proportional representation. And hence, this is where we are today. The process, they had the Attorney General, David Eby, as well with had consulted with a broad range of experts. They had submissions from the public, they had submissions from groups. But ultimately, at the end of the day, David Eby, in consultation with a handful of political scientists, decided to say, let's come up with a process that we think is fair for everybody. So what they recommended was a 2-part question. The first question, very simple. Do you like the maps on the, do you like to be represented with this seats? Or do you want your system of government to look like those seats? Sounds pretty easy. The second question was the details. So ultimately, voting systems and proportional representation, most of them are all going to look the same as far as the seats and the charts and the correlation between votes and seats. The difference between systems is who fills those seats and how do we fill them? So that's the first question is, do you want those seats to match up? And the second question then is, with all the, which way do we want to choose people? So they came up with 3 systems: dual member proportional, mixed member proportional, and rural-urban proportional. And voters are going to have the option of ranking their first choice, their second choice, and their third choice. Even if a voter doesn't want proportional representation and would rather stay with the first choice, they still have the option of filling in the second question and determining, hey, even if I have to change to a system I really don't want, maybe I still get a voice and I still get a say in which of those systems I would prefer. Which is really fair, so you don't even, otherwise you're just letting people who support proportional representation pick the system. This one lets everyone in British Columbia both pick whether we want to change, and then also which system we get to change to. So voters can answer the first question, they can answer the second question, or they can answer both questions. And preferably they will answer one or both of the questions. I know that it's a mail-in ballot, so everyone has an easy opportunity to vote for it. We're hoping that as many people as possible can fill out their ballots. So I want to go back into first past the post a little bit before I talk about the proportional representation system. So the first thing, I've already kind of hampered down the idea of how it ends up basically working. And where we find first past the post is mainly Canada, US, UK, and a handful of former United Kingdom colonies around the world. If you weren't formally governed or ruled by the Queen of England, the chances are you don't have first past the post. The chances are you have a proportional representation system. Nothing to do with the Queen, it's just how the system's passed down through the government. Each riding, the person with the most amount of votes wins, and it's also known as single member plurality. One person per riding. Plurality means the person with the most votes in that riding wins. Benefits? Simple? Simple? It doesn't ring. Generally produces majorities, even though we found in BC has a minority government. New Brunswick just elected a minority government. England has a minority government. So the system can be just as unstable as any other system, and even more so because it makes it much harder to work together in these systems. And there's a link between geography and representation. Every city has a representative. Doesn't matter whether most of the people actually like that representative, but there's one person to turn to. So that's the claim, I call it claim benefits. Other people might call my benefits claim benefits as well. What is wrong with first past the post? Well, the first thing is because of how the system works, and because there's only one person that can win per riding, it often makes sense for parties to attack each other so that you can turn off voters, you can dissuade your other party's supporters from getting to the polls, and you can try to get more of your voters to the polls. By getting more of your voters to the polls in each riding, you're on your way to win a majority government. Vote splitting, as soon as you have more than 2 parties, well, if you have 2 people who are conservative, if you have a BC Liberal and a BC Conservative party, and they can't agree, well, you can have another party with less overall votes than those 2 combined win because those 2 groups or entities can't decide on a single representative. Regional divisions, swing seats, and minorities shut out. So I just got a couple slides to illustrate this. This was actually very recently. Quebec had an election on Monday. In this election, this person won with 26% of the vote. 1 in 4 voters who voted, and I have to say, this riding actually had about 30% of the voter turnout. It was a northern riding. So this person actually won with 8% of the people who could vote in the riding voted for them. So as you can see, across each riding, the person, as often as low as 1 in 4 voters can be the person who could represent you. The CAQ, whether you like them, had ran on, some areas, that seemed to be, banning religious insignia, maybe limiting the number of immigrants. So even if these 3 and 75% of the people didn't agree with them, this person is representing it. And if you look at every single riding across the province, the CAQ just formed government, but had nowhere near the support of the majority of voters. The policies and views that they put forward were not necessarily the views of the majority of the population, yet they have all of the power. This is BC in the last election. The government is represented by Orange, with a little bit of support from the Greens down in southern Vancouver Island, who made a breakthrough in the last election. The opposition is represented by the Liberals in red. And if you can look at the Fraser Valley, we're all red. In fact, there is not a single member of government elected between the boundary between the edge of Surrey and Rosslyn and Smithers. An entire bulk of the province is completely shut out of government. And had there been basically one or two seats changed the other way, the bulk of urban areas, the bulk of Vancouver Island, would have been completely shut out of government. So this is what we have in this system, is we can have systems of government where it's not just one party, it's one region can absolutely run government without having any support from the other areas of the province. This just shows you what Fraser Valley, if I draw the line at the Langley border, and I don't include Maple, I included one with Maple Ridge and one with Langley, you can see that Langley, Abbotsford, Chilliwack, and Hope, not a single member of government. We have a lot of members of opposition. Now, if we rolled it back to the previous government, there wasn't a single member of opposition. So if you had any issues in this area that you didn't agree with the government on, there was nobody to bring your voice into government. Now there's lots of people to bring your voice to be in opposition, but there's no one in government to be your voice. And this is if you draw, so basically if you draw include Maple Ridge, we're still dealing with 90% is basically shut out of government of the entire Fraser Valley. Other regions will see similar distortions in votes. This is how Vancouver Island voted. This is what Vancouver Island got. If you look at the interior, that was almost entirely Liberal, other than a few places in the Kootenays and the coast. The Liberals didn't actually have that much of an overwhelming support. They had just over half of the voters. Yet, if you look at the maps, almost everyone from the interior who voted NDP, Green, even BC Conservatives, some others, has almost no representation. So all we can hear from the interior is whatever that one party wants, not necessarily what other voters or people who may not agree with the party wants as well. In fact, if you look at this because of that map, there's very little incentive for the NDP or for the government to really even try to get voters in those rural areas if they're going to all vote for Liberals anyways, and they can form government with just the seats in the Vancouver and Victoria area. That's our current system. This is, I just want to put this on a map. This is kind of what our system looks like if you actually look at where the MLAs live. I tried to identify which towns they live in, because even though we see that big red zone up there, most of the British Columbia is actually wilderness and crown land. And in fact, there's only a spattering of small towns between there, but these are the major population districts. Now, on this map, if you look really closely, I have two seats that are blinking. These seats were won by 325 and 189 votes. Those two seats, one of them voting the other way, would have had a different government. So if you can live in any of these other seats that don't involve a handful of those seats, and there was a few other seats that were very close as well, those are what we call swing seats. That's where most of the government policy, most spending announcements during the course of an election will happen, is to try to win those changeable ridings. The NDP isn't going to spend a lot of time working and trying to win those voters up in the northern areas, and the Liberals may not spend a lot of time trying to win all those orange seats over. There's just a handful of seats. So, and if you're looking for it, I will. Comox right there, and that's, I believe, Maple Ridge Pitt Meadows, I believe, is the second one. Friends to Foe. That's our current, and Andrew Weaver, that's our current government and the opposition. And one of the opposition members, the Green Party, had supported the NDP, and that's what pushed them to government. Well, they're working fine together, but if proportional representation doesn't pass, in a few short years, they're going to have to go into an election and convince voters why they should vote for each other party. And in every single riding, they're going to go head to head and And depending on if they split, depending on how many people are green, how many people vote NDP in a specific riding, they could risk having the Liberals take that riding just because voters can't decide between those two. Now, I don't want to say this, as far as the Liberals go, or as far as the right people who may be a Conservative bent, we don't actually know if everyone who voted NDP and everyone who voted Green actually are NDP and Green supporters, or they voted the last government out. So we can't always predict what the future election will happen. We can't even predict which parties will exist under a different electoral system. But we know that under our current system, there's going to be a series of they're going to have to somehow position themselves to win each riding. Now I want to talk about proportional representation, because that's the big question. Is something wrong with the system? Yes. The question is, do we like what we want to replace it with? And this seems to be the question in people's minds. Am I going to get something better, or am I just going to get something different? So I just wanted to, and even though we're talking about proportional representation today, it's not a new discussion in this country. This is from a parliamentary debate in 1877, where they were looking at a system that would provide more equal and just representation of electors, minorities, and majorities may be secured. That's basically only 10 years after the bulk of this country had basically for what we know as Canada. Peter Devlin, and I thought this was some interesting quotes, because as much as we want to say what's wrong today, the same things that were wrong today, they were identified as being wrong 140 some years ago. 140 years ago, I think it was 141. So the sole power to rule, make laws, impose taxes, vested exclusively in the party, which happens to command a majority without leaving the minority without representation. And that majority, no matter how small, can rule and see fit to impose on. And that's the basics of what we're dealing with today. Is do you want to shut out voices? And do you want the majority, no matter how small, to rule? Or do we want the principles of forming the representative assembly was that the play should be given to the expression of all opinions and sentiments, so that they may be admitted to the test and scrutiny of discussion. And so that's really what we're looking at under a proportional representation system. That shift between rule by the majority and returning our legislative beings to a place of discussion and representation. The premise, seats should match votes. And as far as proportional representations, I don't really want to focus too much on the world systems, but most places use one variation. Some places use systems where you only vote for parties and you don't vote for any individuals. Most of the other countries have some version of open list, have some version where there's a combination of voting for parties and voting for individuals. And all the systems that we have on proposed in BC, as I'll go to in a second, all have the option of voting for both a bit of a party and individuals as well. We want votes to equal seats. And we want to make, and this is the other thing that's important to remember in this debate, and what will happen with proportional representation. We're not going to be seeing a shift in the seats per region. We're still going to see exactly the same number of MLAs in the rural areas as are under a current system. Now, those numbers shift depending on how population shifts. The more people move to Fraser Valley or move to the interior will determine the seats. But we're not changing up where people are elected. We're just changing up what colors are elected in which area. So we'll probably see more NDP, potentially Greens elected in the interior, and we'll see more Liberals and Blues represented in places like Vancouver Island and Vancouver. It's going to be shifting the seats, shifting the regions under the changes. All proportional representations will elect more diverse representatives, diverse views, less polarized results, more positive campaigns. And the reason why you have more positive campaigns is you're less likely to want to attack and go negative on one party as much as get your own supporters out by being positive and offering a vision. You don't have the same incentive to go as negative. Will there still be negative campaigns? Yeah, if there's two parties that are going head to head, they will still be, but it's not the same under a current system. Under a current system, by just attacking a few voters in a few ridings, going after trying to discourage soccer moms from coming out to vote, we can shift the entire course of an election. Proportional representation, that shift might be 1 or 2 seats, not 20. And easier for parties to cooperate, because if I have 30% of the votes now and I go into the next election, maybe I increase my votes to 35. But under our current system, if you have a 2 or 3% shift, you can shift your seats by 20, 30% of the seats can easily shift. Criticisms, more complex. Your smartphone's more complex than this thing. More likely to result in coalitions, if that's a criticism. Larger districts are more seats. We will be moving towards bigger districts. That's the only way that you can be. You either have to have add more people to make the results fair, or cut down on the number of local seats. Now I just want to, before I go into the 3 systems, some things that won't change. There's a lot of things that parties will appoint the MLAs after election. No, we're not. There are some systems where parties may put forward, some candidates as preferred candidates, but those will all be done well in advance of voters. Voters will be able to see who they're voting for, who they will get if various parties get elected. No local rural MLAs. The boundaries of regions are going to keep the same number of representatives. Extremists will get elected. Maybe. The way it's working, if 150,000 people want to vote for an extreme party, I don't think British Columbia is going to go that way. That's the case. But we can see across the border that under any system, people with very strong and radical views, whether you like them or not, can get elected under any system. So it's not a matter of whether or not a party will get elected. It's a matter of what voters want. Vancouver will get all the power. Vancouver already has most of the power. They're not getting any more. In fact, they're going to get less because they're not going to, because as we saw in the last election, NDP got pretty much most of the seats in Vancouver. Under a different system, they're going to get fewer seats in Vancouver. They're going to have to find seats in the rural areas to compensate for their loss of seats in Vancouver. So that's what your options are going to be looking like. But let's talk about the options, and that's the big question. Dual member proportional. So basically, Abbotsford North and Abbotsford South might become one riding. The one thing I have to say with all the systems is the government hasn't posted lists or maps, and the reason why is because BC doesn't have politicians deciding the riding boundaries and sizes, and we don't really want voters to say, I want to vote on which area I want to be in. We always have had an independent commission, Electoral Boundaries Commission, that will decide where the boundaries in a non-political view are. They will look at, after consultating, and so we avoid what we have in the United States, where you may have an electoral district that looks like a hand because they want to have all the black voters in one riding so that Democrats vote one seat and all the neighboring ridings can be Republican. We don't want that. We don't want the voters to act, or we don't want people to actually vote on a system based on, oh, this riding is good for my party or bad for my party. We want to agree on the key values of a system and find out whether we like those values. So there will be 2 MLAs per riding. Riding sizes will be doubled. They're still going to be smaller than the federal ridings. So I don't hear a huge outcry in British Columbia saying, I want more federal, we need to double the number of federal MPs in Canada. We seem to be happy with sometimes there's issues with between provinces and the support, how many ridings the provinces support has. But so we're still going to have ridings smaller than federal, and the largest ridings might retain some ridings to look the same and vote the same. I think there's a few up in the north that they're not sure if they want to move to proportional representation because they're so spread out, and they said, well, why don't we leave? They don't have a major effect on our riding. Let's leave those alone. So dual member proportional is interesting, and there's 2 representatives in each riding. The first representative gets elected just like they do now. The person with the most votes in the riding will get elected. The second person is actually will be determined based on how the political parties do. So if the Greens, I'm going to skip it and show you, and this is kind of an option of how the ballot might look. I don't really want to focus too much. You might walk into the because I'm going to skip to the next step to show you how. This is the ballot would be, you'd vote for a candidate that say Party A, Liberal or NDP, They would list the first choice and a second choice. Their first choice, if they got the most votes, most X's, they would get elected. But then we look at the province as a whole. So if after the first seats, we had, this is kind of what I used the last election results, is we had about 21 seats, 20 seats. I cut the numbers in half pretty much for what we saw in this current election, and look at what the percentage roughly of the parties would be. So if a party got 21 seats, and they should have got 36 seats because they got 40% of the vote, the Liberals would have had 15 seats. They are required to round them up to the fair number. The NDP would require about 15. The Greens would have got 11 extra, and Conservatives, Independents, I just looped them together, about 4, just as an example. Now, those 15. Now, how we determine who gets those 15 seats is we look at every single riding, and if the Liberal, it will say, where do the Liberals perform the highest? So we say this candidate got 40% or 30%, and they didn't get elected. The candidate in Chilliwack for the NDP got 25%, but they didn't get elected. And you basically create a list to say, which are the most deserving candidates to get seats who didn't get elected and so it's often which candidates come in second in the riding. Now, if a candidate comes in, gets higher, it comes in second place in Chilliwack with 30% of the vote, and a party in Vancouver gets 25, or Burnaby gets 25%, we would say the person who got the highest in their local riding should get elected. So basically, we prepare the whole list of who gets elected, and we go down. So what you would see is, in your specific riding, does my riding, maybe it has a Liberal, and maybe it has an NDP. And there are some quirks in it, that because you're voting for the Liberal, you're voting for 2 candidates from a single party. So if you're voting for a Liberal as a first and a second choice, and the Liberals get about 60% of the vote, the second choice candidate would be deemed to have 30% of the vote. So you're actually, so that's how they determine how that second place candidate gets elected. So if that candidate gets 30% of the votes and the Liberals need some seats and that 30% puts them at the top of that list, you might have a position where the Liberals get the 2 seats. It's very interesting. And this system is completely new. It's never been used. It was kind of designed to say, how do we keep small electoral districts, but yet have proportional representation involved in it? The advantages of this is because of the way it works, the second seats are determined on a province-wide vote. So you can get as pretty much an exact proportionality as possible. So if you're saying, I want my results to be as exactly proportional as possible, I want my ridings, I like to have small ridings, I want to know who my representatives are. If I have 2 representatives, I don't want 4 or 5, I want to know who to go do for my issues. It's going to give you the smallest number of ridings, and everyone is going to be attached to a local riding. No one's going to be floating. Everyone's position of who gets elected will be based on how they did in their riding compared to how their party did across the province. So you're not going to get somebody elected who came in the very bottom of their riding. You're going to get the people who did the best. You're going to get, if the Greens are going to get elected, they're going to have the best Greens. Where do the Greens do the best? That's where they're going to get extra seats under this riding. Now, there are trade-offs. There's no such thing as a perfect electoral system. Every system involves trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs is that because the parties are the second seats are allocated based on how well a candidate does, you could still get some of those regional areas that one party might only get elected in one region. In the last election, the Green Party, for instance, got a lot more support on Vancouver Island. So under a dual member system, you may see almost all the Green members get elected on Vancouver Island. You may see it very well might be every single riding on Vancouver Island could be elected an NDP and a Green, NDP and a Green, NDP and a Green, NDP and a Green. So there's not necessarily a guarantee of regional diversity. And the other aspect, because each party puts forward a first and a second candidate, there may be some jostling between the parties of who should be the first choice. The government, there are some changes you could make. You could give voters that option of which one comes first and second. That would be, if this system did get selected, I think that would be a change that would make a lot of sense. But for now, the The proposal is just to have a first and a second on the ballot themselves. And the other aspect is, because we use provincial results, local results could differ. You could have Abbotsford, a two-member, vote exactly the same way in one election and the same way in a second election, and because the party did better or worse in other riding parts of the percentage, you could end up with different MLA. You could have the second person in your riding could get replaced because his party, another candidate, did better in a different area. So that's one of the quirks. The other thing about dual member proportional that I just missed briefly is it's actually independent friendly. The way that they proposed it is that if an independent candidate comes in second or first in the riding, they get that second seat. So it is actually easier for an independent to win under this system. So that's a very, if people say, I'm not a big fan of parties, well, that might be one of the incentives on that as well. I'm not sure how it would work if any independent candidates come in first and second throughout the province. There might be some problems with the math, but we haven't seen we haven't seen one of these elections anywhere, so we're just trying to look at the scenarios that can work. And in my legal professional, you're always saying what if scenarios. The second system on the ballot is mixed member proportional. It's very common. Germany uses it. New Zealand uses it. Scotland uses it. Wales uses it. And so it's a lot of the countries that, areas that you might say, hey, if we're looking at other countries around the world that may mostly resemble BC, this might be some of our, the countries who use proportional representation we may relate most to. It's been recommended for Canada by the Law Commission of Canada. The Ontario Citizens Assembly recommended it. So it's been one of the systems that has a lot of people pushing to adopt. And it may, from recent polls, it might be one of the front runners as well. Mainly, I think, because it's a simple system to explain and because it has been used for a long time in places like Germany. We changed the seats slightly, so we would have, we'd use about 60% of the, we keep, and all these systems, the proposals is to keep roughly the same number of seats as we have now. So if we're moving from about 90 systems, we might move down to 90 seats locally. We might move to about 60 seats. So ridings will probably get about 1.5 times bigger. So slightly larger, still much smaller than the federal districts, and for most of us, much smaller than the municipal districts that we vote on now. We vote for councillors who represent the equivalent of 4 ridings. So it's much smaller than most of our cities. 40% of the seats will be regional seats, and they will be allocated based on party votes. So if a party if a party needs 10 extra seats to make sure it's fair, each of the regions will have seats allocated on a regional basis to even out. Now there's 2 ways we select those seats. One is, and this is what a lot of people are thinking that had thought, and this is a lot of the negative ads, is one is that the party will give you a list of candidates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or more, for your local area. They say, well, if we need 3 extra seats, you rely on the seats that we give to you. But it's looking like more and more that the NDP, Greens, who have the majority in the legislature, if this passes, they've all said they would rather have a seat where voters themselves can determine which candidates from that party list get elected. So you might see very well a ballot that looks like one set of, hey, I want to vote for this candidate locally, and maybe I want to, or I might, sorry, this one just has the party list, but you may very well see a party list that says, hey, these are my 5 candidates. I want Liberal 1, Liberal 2, Liberal 3. This is one of the details we need to work out. In my view, both of those systems are better than our current system. I don't have a problem myself if a party puts together a list that has maybe 3 or 4 really excellent good candidates, and I like that list that party's put together, I may vote for that party based on those 3 or 4 candidates. So it's not, are the party putting forward a team? Yes, they're putting, they've given us the list. If I don't like those people they put on those lists, I personally am going to go to the next party and say, what does your list look like? That's if we choose a closed list system. If we choose an open list system, I may look at their candidates and say, I don't like any of your 3 candidates. Maybe I like 2, so I'm going to vote for those 2. That's the party I'm going to choose. So, the question is how much control, that voter choice, this is one of those questions, how much choice do the voters actually get? Do we use a closed list or an open list system? But what we know is they will all be determined regionally, and voters will see all the candidates in advance. So this is, what we would probably see is mainly, this is an example of a Fraser Valley region. So if they're entitled to 5 seats locally based on our last election results, and they should be getting 5, they've got 4 and they should be getting 5. 1 will come from the Liberal list or from the candidates on that open list that are chosen. 2 would be from the NDP list and 1. So this system really doesn't rely on a provincial list. It's going to be, the province is going to be divided in regions, and that's how those proportional results are going to be. So when you're voting for somebody, you know that, hey, my region is going to be fairly represented. I'm not going to lose, no region of BC is going to lose any seats under this system. Advantages? Well, a lot of people like the fact that you still have that local MLA involved. You still know, hey, this is my Abbotsford specific one that I can go to, but I also have those regional representatives if I'm not in favor of my local. Relatively simple to calculate and balanced regional representation, because how the voters do in each region, if the NDP gets 30%, the Liberals get 40%, on each region that's how the seats will look. So we're not kind of relying on a province-wide map, and we're not going to see that big, huge red-orange divide down the middle of the province. We're going to see a rainbow here, a rainbow there of candidates. Trade-offs, you're going to still have some seats that might be considered safe seats. Some of your local seats, you still could have some of the issues where, because more voters have voted locally, your local candidate could still be not the most popular person in the riding. So you still have some of those questions. It's tough for independents. It's just as tough as our current system would be, because you still are voting for a political party first of all, and the independent has to win under the system would have to get more votes than all the rest of the parties. And some people have concerns that there might be some MLAs will be local MLAs, some will be regional. They might have different concerns. The regional one may say, how do I get elected to my spot? And the local MLA says, hey, my constituency is a little bit different on that. So there is going to be some differences in how the politicians may relate. We're not quite sure. Our current system, the parties basically tell the MLAs what to do. I don't know if much will change in that regard under any of these systems, but we will just have different parties. We will have different voices. There will be different incentives for parties to tell their local individuals. We might actually see regional representatives revolt against their party, saying, "Hey, why do I want to do that? That policy is bad for our region. We're going to lose votes here. Maybe we're going to push back." We don't really know how this is going to work, but we know that it's going to work differently. We know that it's not going to have some of the same evils with, "Hey, let's just ignore this entire region because, hey, I'm not going to get any seats there anyways." To win under the system, parties are going to have to campaign in each region of the province to get those seats. You don't want to leave any seats off there. The third system, and just a question, what time are we at here?
5:52.
5:52, perfect. Well, right on time. Rural-urban proportional is the third option. Now rural-urban proportional is actually going to have 2 voting systems for British Columbia. The bigger districts, the more dense populated districts are going to adopt the BCSTV system that the Citizens Assembly recommended. We're not sure exactly what the maps will be, but we know how that system, we know actually a lot of details in that system from what we voted on the last election. Now the rural areas are going to use mixed member proportional. So if you're in a rural area and you're trying to choose which system you want, it's actually quite difficult for you. It might be difficult for you to say, do I prefer mixed member proportional or rural-urban? Because you're basically going to get the same voting system under either system. But if you're living in an urban area, if you live in the Fraser Valley, Vancouver, you're going to have a different system than some of the people might in the kind of the more rural northern areas. So I don't really want to, I've already kind of talked a little about mixed member proportional. I want to talk about the single transferable vote, just in case a proponent of it. So SDV is used in Ireland and Australia's Senate. Mixed member proportion is used in Scotland and New Zealand. So it's kind of interesting if you look at rural-urban proportional. The Scots and Irish won't like you do this, but if Scotland and Ireland split off and formed their own country, they would have rural-urban. This system would be basically what they would be using there, because Ireland already uses single transferable vote, and Scotland would be using mixed member proportional. So you can kind of see, hey, how that would work by looking at some of these other countries. Now Scotland's not a country; it's a regional district, but it's in many ways you can see how those systems kind of work with neighboring jurisdictions. Now, urban SDV ridings combined, and I don't necessarily think that they need to go very large. They could go as low as 3. Ireland tends to use a lot of 3, 4, and 5 member ridings, and they deliver a very proportional result. When the Boundaries Commission looked at ridings in the last election here in 2009 and came up with maps, they kind of put a lot more 5, 6, 7 member larger ridings, and which is fair enough. The more members, more people you have in a riding, the more proportional your results can get, because you have more seats to kind of play with. So they will combine neighboring ridings. We might see like Abbotsford, Chilliwack might be one riding as an example. Vancouver might be able to have 2 ridings, a Vancouver West and a Vancouver East, because they have 11 MLAs right now, and so you actually have enough to have two boundaries within one city. And the same with Surrey. Surrey's got a lot of MLAs there, so they might have a Surrey North and a Surrey South electoral district. And my picture didn't come out very clear. This was the map that in 2009 was proposed for, so it had an Abbotsford, Chilliwack. Maps look rather huge and they go right up to here, but no one lives up here, so really you're just dealing with this small area. And that was one of the problems we had in the last election. You had these maps that were just giant, but no one lived in most of the places. So you take the whole province and you say, well, this falls in this electoral district. Well, it really may not, is necessary. You just can't draw a map like this and say, hey, this is not a riding. So how it works is you rank your candidates. You don't have to stay within the same party. So me as somebody who's fairly informed and likes to kind of get involved with and attend meetings and that too, I might have a preference and say, hey, I like this guy from the Liberals, I like this person from the Greens, I like this person from the NDP. I might switch my vote around, between parties. Now a lot of voters might just say, you know what, I'm just voting Liberal and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 Liberal. That's when the Citizens Assembly recommended, that's what they meant by voter choice. The voters could kind of move between parties and candidates as they like. It actually is very interesting that it has very proportional results. And in fact, the single transferable vote was the original proportional representation system. Ireland's been using it since about 1920s, and that was the system that in 1877 when they were talking, that was what they were thinking when they were saying, let's bring in proportional representation. That was what they had discussed, was this idea of just voting for candidates rather than political parties, because political parties didn't even really exist to the same extent as they do today. Often you were just voting for government or opposition. So voters can rank candidates across party lines. If there's 4 seats, there's a system that if there's 4 seats, you actually need 20% of the vote plus 1 to get elected. If there's 5 seats, you actually take the number of seats plus 1, and that's how you create the fraction. For people who don't like math, this system turned them off because of its complexity. 1 divided by 6, is not the hardest to solve. Maybe in your head it might be, but it's not exactly complex math. If any of you are in chemistry or sciences, you would say that's not even hardly even math at all. But that's how we determine it. You say anyone who gets above that threshold will get elected. If one candidate, let's say one of the Liberals gets, everyone loves them. And you need 20% to get elected. And this person, this Liberal lady, she gets 40% of the vote. Well, what we'd actually look at is about half her second votes would go to spread out to other candidates to make sure that the Liberals are still treated with 40% of the vote. So there are some quirks. It's a very interesting system. It's not that complex, but it is definitely more complex than the basic one-person vote just count to the most. Ireland's been using it since basically for about 100 years. Australia uses it in their Senate. and it's used in New Zealand in local elections across New Zealand. And actually, an interesting thing, the system was used in Alberta and Manitoba for much of the 19th century in major cities. So they had, what we see this rural-urban is actually not too much different than how some of the prairies had actually elected MLAs throughout much of their last century, until the system started electing communists, and then they got rid of all these fair systems. That's the problem. If you don't like minorities, it's probably a bad system for you. Rural-urban proportional creates highly competitive urban ridings because not only are parties competing against each other, but the individual candidates in that riding. So if I'm a candidate, I can't just rely on my party. I'm actually competing against my fellow candidate. So it does encourage me to go out and meet as many voters, campaign as much as I can, listen to issues, and maybe not only my own supporters, but maybe, hey, you vote Green? Well, how about choosing me for your second choice? I'm a good person. I support your values. So, candidates aren't just about getting their own voters. They're actually going to have to appeal under this system to other voters. And so that's why it maximizes voter choice. No vote splitting, so the more parties you get, it's not going to really affect the end result because people can rank a second and a third choice if their candidate doesn't get elected. Independent friendly. An independent can run and say, hey, you vote for me second Liberal, and very well independents. In Ireland, independents actually get elected quite frequently, and a single class of MLAs, at least in an urban area. Now the trade-offs is there is no pure local MLA, so if I'm a candidate, I'm going to be representing the whole Abbotsford and Chilliwack. I'm not going to have a specific Abbotsford local or Abbotsford North, Abbotsford South, Chilliwack North, Chilliwack South candidate. But I very well might have, but the way that it works with the voters is that I may very well adopt an area as my own. So if I live in Chilliwack and I'm a community figure in Chilliwack, where am I going to get my support from? Well, I'm going to get my support from knocking on doors in the Chilliwack area. So even though Chilliwack may not be my specific geographical riding, I may still be known as the Chilliwack candidate. So if there's four or five ridings, and two of the candidates are Liberals, the Liberals may very well have one candidate who's from Chilliwack and one candidate who's from Abbotsford, because that's where they're getting their votes from. Who's going to rank? Everyone in Chilliwack is going to rank the Chilliwack Liberal first, and everyone in Abbotsford might vote the Abbotsford. So you don't have the dedicated ridings, but that's seen as a trade-off. Larger ridings, so we are getting rid of this idea of one small riding. We're getting a much not as big of a region as mixed member proportional, but we're going to get we are going to get more of this 4-5 person zones. So, and if you think about what issues face the province, most of those issues are regional. I mean, we elect we elect city councillors and mayors to deal with purely municipal issues. Most of the time, is we want to if we're in Abbotsford here, we want an extra lane on our freeway. Well, that's going to be Abbotsford and Chilliwack. It doesn't matter what riding you are on. I mean, if you don't have a car, you don't care about that issue. But if you have a car and need to commute, it's not going to matter whether you're in Abbotsford North or South. That freeway is your number one issue if you have to commute anywhere. So a lot of the things, if you need a hospital, well, the hospital is a regional district. So we have a lot of these. Most of our provincial issues are regional anyways. So this kind of idea of a strictly local MLA is maybe less of a concern than do we have someone who knows my regional issues. More complex counting, again, fractions. More candidate knowledge. If you just say, I want to, I just vote for Liberal anyways, and I don't really want to do anything more, this system may not have much benefit for you. You might prefer to just say, what, I'm just going to vote for, I'd rather vote for a dual member, where I just vote for a party and that's how the riding comes on. Or mixed member, I can vote for a candidate and we'll see how things sort out afterwards. But, under this system, you could still just choose your party and vote 1, 2, 3. Person with the first in the ballot might, the lowest last name might get more votes because of those voters. We're not sure. So, kind of the end is, we got these 3 choices of systems. So, going back to what the initial question is, what kind of voting system do you? First of all, should we go with proportional representation? My view is it's definitely better than what we have now. perfect? I'm not sure, but it's definitely better. And the question then is, which of the three? You know, I might have my preferences, but I think everyone's got different preferences, and and we all vote for different parties as well. So there's not necessarily a right answer and a wrong answer. It's what is our answer. So I think mixed member proportional. I said, hey, that's kind of like choosing a soccer team. It's what's the best team? You get your local positions. You stay in this one area, and then you got a few strikers who kind of run all over the field. Rural urban is, it's like choosing an all-star team. You don't necessarily pick the team from, you pick the best players from across the team, and all of a sudden, hey, my area is represented by the best from all parties. And do remember, well, you get pairs of two. You hope they work good together. But it's nice, like the nice dancers. If you don't like sports, there's the comic analogy. So, I said mixed member proportion, X-Men. They're all on a team. Someone's gone out and recruited them. They all got special powers. Some people drive the plane. Other people zap things under their eyes. Oh, Avengers, they don't really always, they make their own movies. They don't always work together. But, they're the best at what they do, and sometimes they fight each other, sometimes they don't. And the dynamic duo, except with dual member proportional, Batman doesn't necessarily get to choose his sidekick. The voters do. So yeah, he might get stuck with somebody he doesn't agree with, but he might get stuck with Robin too. So anyways, that's kind of a brief explanation of our referendum.